Isn't it funny that when you're first learning Rails, you may watch a video tutorial about how to create a blog or something similar, but then the teacher will use the scaffold generator, which creates so much code that you can't follow yet, and then they finish the tutorial by stating that most actual Rails developers will not use the scaffold generator. They also don't go through the process of testing. So this really doesn't help you when you're trying to figure out how would a real-world Rails developer work. That's what I'd like to offer you today is the Introduction to Rails tutorial that I wish I had had. We're going to use TDD, test-driven development. We're going to actually create controllers and models manually rather than using scaffolding. And then I'm going to teach you exactly what each step means. So let's get into it. Before we move forward, the first thing is, of course, you need to have Ruby installed on your system. I'm not going to go through that process, but if you need to get there, you can refer to this tutorial on NetTuts. That'll give you step-by-step instructions on how to use RVM to install Ruby. Then, at that point, it's simply a matter of running gem install Rails to get Rails installed on your system. It's really quite easy. So once you've done that, let's go ahead and create a new Rails project. I will open my terminal and you can see here I am within my desktop. So I'm going to run Rails new, and we're going to build just a very, very simple task type app so that we can demonstrate how you would go about testing and using controllers and models. It'll be really easy. So Rails new, and we're going to call this tasks. However, by default, Rails uses test unit for its testing framework. But as you'll find, it seems that most Rails developers prefer to use something called RSpec. So we need to create a new Rails project, but I'm going to pass -T, and that means don't create the test suite. So you can see that it created all of these files, and now it automatically runs bundle install. And this is where it will automatically install all the gems that you require. Next, I'm going to cd into that tasks folder, and I'm going to open it within my code editor. Here we are. So if we open up the gem file, this is where we can specify any gems that are required for our Ruby on Rails project. So before we get started building our project, we need to get our spec ready to go. So we need to reference the gem, but only within development and testing. So we'll create a new group for test and development. We're going to bring in the turn gem. And if you run Rails new project by default, this will automatically be set up for you. And it just gives you some pretty printing for your test results. Next, we're going to bring in RSpec Rails. And I've found from personal experience that, especially if you're maybe coming from the PHP world, it can be a little confusing coming to grips with the idea of test-driven development. But if you use the Capybara gem, I think that's a really excellent way to dive into it, because what Capybara does is it simulates the user, so it will sort of be like your assistant. If you would normally open up the browser and test out a form to see maybe what is returned, Capybara will do that for you so that you don't have to repeat those steps over and over. It's a really easy way to get into test-driven development. Next, we're going to set up a way to automatically run our tests so that we don't have to manually run rake test. So I will also bring in the guard RSpec gem. And lastly, if you are using a Mac and you'd like to see Growl notifications, you can bring in the Growl Notify gem. When your tests run, it'll display a little Growl notification letting you know whether it passed or whether it failed. Okay, and I'll save that. And now that I've updated my gem file, I need to run bundle install again so that we can download any of these gems that we don't already have on our system. So I can either run bundle install, or you can just shorten that to bundle. There we are. And now you can see that these RSpec gems and guard were installed. Next, we need to install RSpec. So you can see what generators are available to you by typing Rails generator, or you can use G for short. Now, because we have brought in the RSpec Rails gem, you see we have a new generator here, RSpec:install. So let's run that now. Rails G RSpec install. And here we can see it created an RSpec file, a spec folder, and a spec helper. Next, we need to go ahead and initialize guard. That will do our auto testing. So I will run guard init, and we're using RSpec. Okay, so now it created the new guard file. Let's test it out now, and I will type guard, and this will automatically run our tests. And because we have none found, you can see 0 examples, 0 failures, and now we are showing the Growl notification. Now I can exit out of this by pressing Control-C. Now you also might want to install the RBFS event gem. Okay, and now that we've gotten all of these gimps installed, let's get started by creating an integration test, which will give you a really easy to understand introduction to using test-driven development in Rails. So I will run Rails G for generate integration test, and this is going to be for tasks. And what you see right here is it created a new requests folder, and within it a tasks.spec.rb file. If we want to browse to that, we can open up spec, requests, and task_spec. And you can see it gives us some sample code here where it will get the /tasks path and make sure that a response of 200 was returned. So let's go ahead and try this out now. I'm going to run guard, and that will automatically run these tests for us. And what we see here is it's already failing, and this is good. Get tasks index path, it doesn't know what that is. And what that's referring to is on line 7. It's trying to figure out what this variable name is, and we haven't created that yet, but we don't need any of this. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this, and let's get started. And we're going to use these tests as a way to sort of chart out what we're going to be building. So what we can see here is we have a describe block, and the way this will read out when you run your tests is tasks get tasks. So we're describing our tasks feature, and for this section, we're going to describe when you get /tasks. And in this case, what I wanted to do is it should display some tasks. So we can use Capybara, and we're going to say visit, and we want to get the path to tasks. So really what we want is tasks path. However, this will only be created if we create the necessary routes. So if, for example, if I come here and I'm going to create a new tab and browse to our tasks folder, and if I run rake routes, what you'll see here is we have nothing. We haven't created any routes. And you can confirm that by either quickly browsing to the routes file, or you can also find that within config routes. And what we see here is there is nothing. So what we want to do is create a resource routes, because we know for our tasks we want to show them, we want to edit them, we want to delete them, we want to have what we would call RESTful routes. And we can do that by using resources. So if I type resources tasks, what that's going to do is it's going to create 7 routes. And now watch what happens if I rerun rake routes. Now we have these 7 paths for get, post, put, and delete. And you can see we're also given these keywords. So for example, if we wanted to browse to /tasks/ the task ID number /edit.erb or JSON, you can see we can use this variable name, this keyword edit task. Same thing for task. That would be to show a specific task. New task would be to create a new task, and tasks would be to obviously display all of the tasks on the page. The only thing you need to know here is when you're using these keywords, you need to append _path. So it would be new _task _path, edit _task _path. So now that we've created these, we can use them, close out our routes because we're done, and we can say visit tasks path, and that will translate to this one right here, visit /tasks. Okay, so we know on this page that some tasks should be displayed. So why don't we say page.should have content, and we want to make sure it has a task that says maybe go to bed. Now at this point, of course, we know it's going to fail, but that's good because you want to go from red to green. Right now, we're charting out what it should do. So it should display a task that says go to bed, and I think that's fine for this specific page. However, we of course need to create a database and a table where we can store these tasks. But before we do that, let's return to the terminal, and you're going to see all of this code here likely. And what it's showing us is right here, file to load, there seemed to be a load error for the routing folder. And this is something that guard will want to see from you. There is no routing folder within spec. So let's go ahead and add that now so that guard doesn't get angry with us. And I can simply run make directory spec routing. Now, if I run guard again, that should get rid of it. There we are, and we get a growl notification, 1 error. And what it's saying is visit tasks path, uninitialized constant tasks controller. And that means it's looking for a controller for tasks, but one hasn't been created yet. And that's what we need to do. So let's run Rails generate or G controller, and this is going to be controller tasks. And by the way, I'm going to assume that you have a basic understanding of the MVC pattern. If not, you might want to take a step back and read some MVC articles on NetTouch before you continue. So this controller will generally be plural, and your models will be singular. Now, after we name our controller, we can also go ahead and create some of the views and what we call the actions for it. You don't have to, but it's helpful. So if I create a action called index, this will create the index action, and it will also create an index.html.erb view. We can take a look at that now. I'm going to open up app controller, and now we created that. So these generators are just ways to quickly create code. So this created our task controller, and it created an index action. And it also, because we added the index, it will also create within the view a tasks folder as well as an index.html.erb. So let's go ahead and boot up the Rails server. I'm going to run Rails server, or again, it can be Rails S. And what we can see here is that Rails is available at localhost :3000. And this is the default index.html page. But what we want to do is go to tasks. And there we are. And now you can see, because we created that controller and we passed the index action, we now have a default view that displays. But in this case, I do want this to be the default page for our little web app here, but it's still showing this. So I'm going to press Control-C to exit out of here. And next, I'm going to remove it. And it's stored within the public directory. Now, if we return to our project and we go into public, this is where you'll have your static files like index.html, a 404 page. But in this case, we don't want index.html. So you can either delete it here, or you can do it quickly from the terminal by doing remove public index.html. Next, I'm going to open up my routes. I will also add a route, and I can say route to. The root route is going to link to the name of the controller, followed by a £, and the action name. So in this case, we want, if we go back to app, tasks controller, we want tasks and the index action. So we'll do that now. Okay, and now let's run Rails server again, and let's see if that's working as we would hope. And now by going to the root URL, we are in fact directed to the tasks controller and the index action. So we're not going to do this too much, but you should be using Git. You can learn how to install Git on NetTouch, or you can Google it. So let's go ahead and run Git, and we're going to add all the files to the staging area, and I'm also going to commit them, and we'll say first commit. There we are. And that way we can set snapshots of points so that you can return to them. If you make a mistake, you can roll back to where you were previously. It's definitely a good practice to get in the habit of. All right, so let's return to our test so that we can plot out our project. We know here that when we go to the home page, we want to visit it and we expect to see GoToPed. So we need to set up a database to do that. And we can do that by saying Rails G for generate model, and we're going to call this task. Now notice this is the singular. Your model will be named singular because that way we can use active record to execute commands like task.all, which will run select star from tasks in your database. It's very nice. Also, the excellent thing about this is you don't have to deal with all of the SQL code. You can stick with Ruby and all of your SQL commands will be generated dynamically. So just as we did with controller, we can specify what fields we want within our table. In this task table, I'm going to keep it very, very simple. All we want is a task. And I'm going to specify a colon here, and we can say, should it be a string? Should it be text? In this case, a string will be fine. Also notice that I haven't added a primary key, an ID, and that's because Rails will do it for you automatically. You don't need to. Now, when I hit enter, this is not going to create the database. All it's going to do is create what we call a migration file. So you can see it's stored within db/migrate. Browse to that, db migrate, and this created the Ruby code for you based on what we typed in. It specifies that we should create a table called tasks, and within it, it's going to add a field with the name of task, and it's going to be set to a string. And Rails will also add the timestamps, which will be created at and updated at. You don't have to do that for you. And again, the ID will be generated automatically as well. So now, if you want to run this migration, we can say rake db:migrate, migrate the database. There we are. And now you can see it ran the migration. It went ahead and created the table called tasks. So if you want to test this out, we can open up the console. Rails console, or again, that can be reduced to Rails C. Now this is similar to IRB, but we also have access to the Rails backend. So now we can access that tasks table via the task model that we created when we did Rails generate model task. If I type task, you'll see it gives us the schema for task. If I want to run task.all, this is active record. We're select star from tasks, but we're using nice Ruby code to do it rather than using SQL. It's really neat. So let's say you want to add a row to this table. I can run task.create, and in this case, we only had a task field. So the task will be go to the store. Now, when you run create, that will automatically run this query, insert into tasks. Now, if we want to see all of the rows in the table, I run task.all, and now it's brought in that one. Or if you want to search for one, I can say task, and in this case, the ID is 1. So I can say find 1 or find 1. And now that's transferred into a query that says select tasks from tasks, where the ID is equal to 1. So this isn't specifically an active record tutorial, so I think that's enough to know how to do task.all and task.find and task.create. So I'm going to exit out of here by typing Control D, and let's get back to our testing. So back within tasks_rspec, I want to create some sample data because remember, when you're testing, it's going to use a different database than your production or your development database. So for the time being, within this block right here, we'll go ahead and create a row. And we'll say task, create an instance variable called task will be equal to task.create. And what is the field name task? And what will the value be? Go to bed. And now we know within our test table, we do have this new task. So let's see what the next step is. And when we do TDD, this is a nice way to just be told exactly what your next step is. Let's return and let's see. If you get this error right here, active record statement invalid, make sure that you close out guard by pressing Control C because we had created a new model. So let's restart guard back up. There we are. And let's look at our first failure. Page.shouldHaveContent go to bed. It expected the words go to bed to be within that index.html.erb view, but it did not occur. So let's do that now. I'm going to open up my controller right here, task controller, and within here we need to fetch all of the tasks from the database. Because we created a model with a name of task, we can then run task all, which will translate to select star from the tasks table. And I'm going to store that within a variable called tasks. However, this is fine if I only want to work with this data within the action. However, if I want to access it from the view, I'm going to make it an instance variable by prefixing the @ symbol. Now if I save it, I can browse to views, tasks, the index.html.erb view. Notice that this name translates specifically to the action name, and this is Rails defaults. If you do not specify a different view name, it will automatically look for something with the name of the action. So for example, if we shortly create an edit action, by default, it's going to look for a view called edit.html.erb. Okay, so we have gone ahead and created an instance variable that contains all of the tasks that are currently stored in the database. Now we're going to filter through them. So I'll create a h1 tag that says tasks, and then I'm going to say for task in tasks, let's echo out maybe a list item. So we'll wrap this all within an unordered list. And then within here, we'll say list item, task, and I believe we called the column name task. So let's save that and let's go ahead and view it in the browser. I'm going to once again boot up the Rails server. And now ultimately you'll get to the point where you don't open up the browser for testing like this, but we're still at a beginning stage, so it's okay. Now we can see we do have tasks and we are displaying everything that's stored within the table. In this case is just 1. Okay, so now that we know that we're displaying all of the rows from the database, our test should pass. If we return, we can see there were 5 examples, 0 failures, and 3 pending, and this is just some options that we haven't yet added. Now we could delete these files if we don't want to use them. For example, the views folder, that's where you can place additional specs for your views. In this case, we're using integration tests, so you could delete that if you wanted to. Remove spec views. Now that's going to say you can't do it, so we're going to say remove with recursive force. There we are. I'm going to start up guard again, and again there are 0 failures. Good, so we have done our first test and we have turned that to green. The next step is we want to be able to add a task. So we could have a link to new task within here, or we can just add a little task input below, and this is fairly common. So let's do that. Right here, we're going to add a new block, and we'll say it creates a new task. So once again, for this test, we are going to visit the tasks path, and then we want to have a form. So we will say we're going to fill in an input that either has an ID, a label, or a name attribute of task. And what are we going to fill it in? We're going to fill it in with text that says go to work. So what this does is it loads that default tasks path right here, and then it's going to fill in a field. And it's going to look for either an ID of task, a name of task, or a associated label of task. And it's going to fill in that input with go to work. Now there's a very cool gem called Launchy, and we can reference it like so, gem Launchy. And this gives us the ability to get a visual snapshot of what's going on. Once you install that, and we can close this out and run bundles to make sure that we bring in that new gem, I can say save and open page. And this will let you see exactly what's going on. Let's run guard again, and that's going to run. And once it gets to this point, it's going to load that current state in the browser for you to look at. However, of course, in this case, it's not going to because it's failed before it got there. And we can see here, it can't fill it in because it can't find anything named task. So we'll add that shortly, but let's just add a little bit more in here. We're going to fill in the input that says task, and then I want to click a button that will go ahead and create the task. So try to visualize this in your head, and the button will say add task on it. So we're going to find a button that says add task and click on it. When you click on that button, we then want to go through the process of creating the task. So then it will reload the current page, because when we click on that button, it's going to send a post request to the current tasks path page. So if you want to verify that, you can say the current path.should equal the root path. Next, I can say page.should have content go to work. Hopefully this makes sense. Let's go through it again. We're going to go slowly. We're going to visit the tasks path. We're going to look for an input or a label that says task. And when we find it, we're going to fill that input with the string go to work. Then we're going to click the add task button. Then we're going to run an operation that will add the task to the database. Once we've done that, the current path should equal the root path because we're still on that page, and it should now have a task that says go to work because it has been added to the database. And then when we run through this for end statement, that will be displayed on the page, at which point this should be true. And then finally, we're going to save and open the page. So let's save that and see what our spec says right now. What is the first thing we need to do to make this happen? And we can see it's right here. We need to go ahead and create the label task and the input. So I will first close these out and return to index.html.erb. And now I'm going to add a form here. So we'll say form for, and this is going to be a form for creating a new task. So for the time being, for now, it's going to be for a new task. And again, remember, we're using task because we created that model called task. So this will be the process of how you would create a new task with Active Record. And I'll call do, represented by F. There we go. So now let's go ahead and create the label, f.label, and this will be the label for the task field within the table. Next, I'm going to create the input itself. So that should just be a text field. And again, that's going to be associated with the task column within the table. And then finally, they need to click on a button, of course. So I'm going to run f.submit. Now this alone will create the form for you, and it will also provide a lot of security for you, such as CSRF protection. And we have an undefined local variable. Of course, that shouldn't be form.for, form_for. And now if I view source, what you'll see is it created all of this for us, and we only had to type just a few lines of code. So you can see that it sets the action to /tasks. And that's because we did say form4task.new. So Rails was smart enough to know that that needs to link to /task or tasks_path. It also applies a class and ID for you. It sets the method to post. It adds some protection for you. All of this is done automatically. And then it adds the label, the input, and the submit button. And I want you to know that for the fields, it uses this array syntax, task. So now let's see what our test says. And here's our next task. No button with value or ID of add task was found because we have here create task. So we could either update this value right here, or we can simply return to our spec and change this to create task. Let's run it again. And now we can see it did click on the button, but then it got an error and it said the action create could not be found. And that's because when we're working with a RESTful pattern, when a post request is sent to the default page, it's going to look for a create action on the controller, and one does not exist. So we can run create. And this is where we will go through the process of adding whatever they type into that text box to the table in the database. So with Active Record, we can create a new row by running task.create, and we need to be able to pass it the contents of that form. So for now, why don't we render text, and I want to show you what's stored within params. If you're coming from a PHP world, this would be the same as get and post. So let's see what we have coming through. I'm going to write go to mall, create task. This is the hash, and it contains information about the task. It also specifies what the action is. It's create. The controller should be tasks, but what we really want to have access to is this task hash right here. So I'd like to pass that to the task model. Task. Now we can either do .new, at which point we would have to pass in all the fields and run task.save, or we can combine all that by doing create. And then I'm simply going to pass the task hash. And that was all made for us automatically because we did this syntax. So that will create it. And then why don't we go ahead and for now, let's redirect back to the previous page. So let's return to our test and see what that did for us. Okay, good. And now we're on to the next one. We see it expected the current path to equal the root path. But of course that didn't work. That's a mistake on my part. I can go ahead and fix that right here. And we can say the current path should be equal to, sorry about that, not the root path, the tasks path. Save it. Guard will automatically rerun our test. And now you can see it automatically opened up the current state within the browser. And again, that's because we had the Launchy gem installed and all of these passed. So then it ran save and open page. And this lets us see exactly what is set up. And you can see we are using Capybara up here. So good, we've added our first feature. 5 examples, 0 failures. If you want to do a manual test, let's do that as well, because that's always important to do as well. And we'll say take a break. And there we go. So now we have successfully added the option to add tasks. Next, let's take it a little bit further. We want to have an option to edit and delete because we're going to go through the whole CRUD process. So let's do that now. I'm going to return. And before we write the code, let's create the test. So we're going to create a new describe block. It edits a task. Visit the tasks path, and he should be able to click on a link that I would assume says something like edit. And when he does, at that point, they should be redirected to the edit post path. So at that point, the current path should equal the edit task path. Now, edit task path, again, is another key variable name that was created when we added the resources tasks to our routes file. However, when you run edit task path, we should be able to pass within the parentheses the task itself that we're editing. And in this case, we put task all the way up here, but I'd like to have access to it in multiple areas. So why don't we do it right up here, and we're going to say before each of them, let's go ahead and run this code. That way, this will always be available. So now I can simply pass that in like so. And this will correctly refer to the row in the table that says go to bed. So we visit the tasks path. We look for a link that says edit. We click on it. And then at that point, we should be on the edit tasks path route, essentially. Now we know that when we edit a task, it should display that form again, and it should have that input, and that input's default value should be equal to whatever the task is. So we should say page.shouldHaveContent, and in this case, it should say go to bed. That was the default value that was in the table, but now we're going to update it. So then we'll say fill in, once again, that task that says label, and we're going to fill it in with a new value. And we'll call it updated task. And then we're going to click a button, and I assume this button will say save. Or why don't we change it to update task? Good. And once I click on that button, page.shouldHaveContent updated task. Okay, so let's go through each step again. If you understood it, feel free to fast forward 30 seconds. We're testing out the process of editing a task, our new feature. We're going to visit the tasks path, and we're going to look for a link that says edit. And we're going to click on it. And at that point, we're going to be taken to the edit task path route. Then when we click on that, there should be a form, and one of the inputs should say go to bed, or something should say go to bed. Then we're going to update it. So we're going to fill in the input that is associated with either an ID, a name, or a label that says task. And we're going to change it to updated task. And then we're going to click a button that says update task. And then once that button is clicked, we want to see a page that says updated task, because we will be redirected to the tasks path. So if you want, you can say current path, then should equal tasks path. We're taken back to the main page that displays all of our tasks. And if we did it correctly, it should display that new value. Okay, so let's check out our spec and see what we have to do first to make that happen. No link with title, ID, or text edit found. All right, let's do that now. Within here, within our list item, bring this down, and we'll just do a pipe for the time being. And we're going to add a link, so we'll use the Rails link to helper, and we'll set the value of this link to edit, and the ref will be edit task path. And we're going to pass in this task row. Okay, let's close that out, and let's view it in the browser. Good. So now we have a pipe in the word edit. It is taking us to the edit path. Next, no action of edit was found in the task controller. So let's do that next. Right here, we'll create a new action called edit. So remember, when we load the edit action, it's now going to look for a view called edit.html.erb. So let's create that manually. And we'll say edit for the time being. This view needs to receive the specific task that the user wishes to edit. Now, if we return to the browser, remember when I hover over edit at the bottom, we are automatically passing through the ID of the task itself. You'll see here at the very bottom left, the task ID is 2 and the other one is 1. So we can capture that by doing params ID. So I will say create an instance variable called task and make that equal to the task model, create the SQL code to find the row that has an ID of whatever is stored within params ID. So that will return a row, presumably, and then it will load this view. Now this view should display the form, but let's think about it. It's going to be more or less the exact form that you see here. So we could copy that and paste it in, but then we're duplicating and we're repeating ourselves. So why don't we create a partial? And we can do that by going to our views, tasks folder, and I will create a new file, and we're going to preface it with an underscore so we can tell Rails that it is a partial, and it will be called form. Now I will paste that in there, and that way I only type this markup or code once, and within the edit file, I can simply run render form, like so. Now I need to go to index.html.erb, and I'm going to do the same thing here as well. So now the edit view will load. I'll change this to an H1, and then we're going to render a form. Click on it, and we are taken to the edit page, and it does display our form. But remember, one error I remember is that this input should by default display whatever was stored within the table. Let's go back to our test and see what's going on right now. Page.shouldHaveContent go to bed. It expected it to be there, but it could not find it. And that's because if we come back right here, if we load our form, this form now is bound to the task.new action. But we really don't want that. We want it to be connected to maybe an edit action or a new action. So why don't we change this to an instance variable called task? I'm going to return to our controller, and we call the form from the index, and we'll create another instance variable called task equals task.new. Then when you click on edit, task will equal task.find params ID. That way the form represents something different each time. Let's return to our test and see what's going on now. And still we see that it expected the string go to bed to be on the page, but it's not finding that at all. So why don't we try this instead? Find field, and we're going to look for the field that says task and its value of that input dot should equal go to bed. I think that should work. Our test will run again. There we go. And now we passed click button update task, and it says the action update could not be found. Come back to task controller and we'll say def update. Next we see here there's a missing template because it expects to have something to load when it redirects to this action. So let's go ahead and write the code that will update this row in the database. I'll say task, it's going to be equal to task.find according to the row in the table that has the ID as what was passed in. Next, I'm going to say if task, and we're going to run update attributes, and we're going to pass in the task. So what we're doing here is we're trying to update the row within the table with these new fields. And we're going to say if you are successful, then redirect back to the tasks path. And this is going to redirect to the page that displays all of the tasks. Otherwise, we will redirect to, and I'm going to say back. We're going to go back essentially to the edit post page. And we will eventually do a notice, but I'd rather do that in just a few moments. And now we see 3 examples, serial failures. Good. Perfect. Let's now do a manual test, take a break, and notice that now take a break is displaying. get back to work. Update task, and we've been redirected back to tasks path, and it does display it. Good. Now we also need to think about ways that we can break things. So for example, if I go to edit and we remove this entirely, is there the option that we could have a task that has no value? Yes, it does, and that's not good. So let's add a little bit of validation. I'm going to go to my model and open up task.rb. And validation in Rails is incredibly easy. We can say validates, and then we give a specific field in our table. Ours was called task. And we want to make sure that presence is true. Now, watch what happens. If we reload this and I try to go to the store, we edit it to nothing, update the task, it just reloads this page completely because there was an error. And it's doing that because we specified that it should. Right here, we attempted to update the attributes, but then Rails specified that task could not be nil, essentially. So it redirected back. We should provide a notice. So let's add that to our testing. We'll do another one and we'll say it should not update an empty task. And this will be a shortened form. So we'll say visit tasks path, click the link so that we can edit a task. And then we will say fill in that input of task, and we're going to fill it in with an empty string. Then we're going to try to update it. So click button, update task. And when you do that, the current path should not be the tasks path. The current path should equal the edit task path again because it redirected back. And we also want to say page.should have content. There was an error updating your task. Okay, let's save that and let's see what our spec says we should do first. Page.should have content. There was an error updating your task. So all of this passed, we did everything, but then we got here and we did not display a little notice. So let's do that right now. We will return to our controller. And while I'm at it, I'm gonna go ahead and close some of these extra tabs out. We will redirect back and we're going to send through a notice that says there was an error updating your task. And we'll do the same thing while we're here. When we add a task, your task has successfully been updated. Okay, now we can filter through these flash notices by, if I go to views, layouts, we'll display it right here. That's a good place. And at the top, I'm going to say flash. This is something that Rails gives to us automatically. We're going to filter through everything that's in there. And for each one, we'll have the name, and this will be whether it's a notice or something like that. And then it'll also have the message itself, which in our case would actually be your task has successfully been updated. So let's filter through those, and I'll show you one way to do it. One way would be to create a div, and we could display the message itself, and we'll give this an ID of /_name. All right, let's view this in the browser to test it out. Go to the store, we're gonna change this to stores, update task. And we do see that, and if I click on inspect element, you'll see that it gave it an ID of /_notice. And what's cool about this is you can then go into your style sheet. So app, assets, style sheets, and we'll just place it right here for the time being. And we'll say flash notice. We'll set a background color maybe of red, and actually why don't we make the color green, and we'll set a border to 1 pixel solid. And because we're using Sass, let's just darken that green color by 20%. Next, I'm going to align the text to the center, give some padding of about 5 pixels, and I think that's fine. So let's try it out. Edit a task, change it, update it, and now you can see it does display that. Maybe you want to set color to white. There we are. That looks fine. And lastly, let's make sure that we have the correct error. So I will remove everything, update task, and it does say there was an error updating your task. Now, before we move on to deleting a task, one quick thing right here is if you would like to shorten this, Rails also provides a helper called content tag. So you could do the same thing here by saying content tag. We're going to create a div, and the HTML for it will be equal to the message. And if you want to give it an ID as well, you could say ID equals /_name. And this will essentially be the exact same thing. So it's just a matter of what you prefer. I'll go ahead and comment that out. Next, let's implement the feature where we can delete a task, and we'll do that much more quickly. Return right here and add a new describe block, and now we will add it should delete a task. So as I see it, we would want to visit tasks path, and right now I'm going to add click link delete task, but something I want you to think about is there will be multiple links that say delete task. So if you want to target specifically the one that we've added right up here, if you want to say click on the link, that is this one right here, find, and here we can pass a CSS selector. So what we would want to do then is when we are displaying all of our tasks right here, we would want to give an ID to each one. ID equals task.id. Now if I load and I click inspect element, you'll see that each one has an ID. And we might want to change that to task underscore, something like that. There we go, task 1 and task 2. Then we could come back and say, look for find task underscore, and then we're going to look for that task instance variable that we created right up here, .id. And we're going to look for that specific ID and then click link, and it will say delete task. That way we can be sure that we're clicking on a specific link if multiple links will have the exact same text. Now when we do that, page should then have content. We're going to have a notice that says task has been deleted. And also, the page should no longer display this task because it was deleted. That should have no content. All right, so let's implement this. First, we go to RSpec and see what we need to do. And here we see that it couldn't find anything that says delete task. All right, that's our first step. Index.html, link to, and why don't we change this instead to delete? And now we're not going to do anything like delete tasks path. That's not what we want. Instead, we can use the shortcut task here. Now, this is the same shortcut if you were to show a specific task, but we can specify that it should be the delete method by doing method delete. And we'll close that out. Also, while I'm thinking of it, let's go back to our spec and make sure we remove delete task to just say delete. If you'd like to see this in the browser, if it helps, let's add this one, do work. Now we see we have these options for edit and delete. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see edit links to the edit post path. And delete looks like it's linking to the show path, but because we specified that the method is delete, Rails will understand that it needs to trigger the destroy action. Let's come back to our testing and see what to do. The action destroy could not be found. Right here, destroy. And here what we're going to say is get that task model, and we're going to destroy the row that has the ID of what was passed in. And then we're going to redirect to, we'll just go back here and have a notice that says, there we go. And now we can see 6 examples, 0 failures. So the last step here is just to do some quick manual testing for our own peace of mind. That was updated. I'm going to try to remove it entirely. Update. Good, that didn't work. And then also delete. We're going to delete this task do work. Works fine, task has been deleted. Okay, and I think that's going to do it today. We've covered quite a bit, and doing this test-driven style of development is definitely going to be foreign, especially if you're coming from a PHP world, but I think the more you do it, the more it's going to grow on you. While it seems like you're writing all of this extra code, the truth is when you're doing all of this manual testing in the browser, it adds up to even more time. And when you do it once here, it's like you have a virtual assistant that will keep running these for you, just in case you make an error, you delete a line and you didn't mean to, it will catch all of your mistakes. So thank you so much for watching. For more tips and tutorials, always follow us on NetTuts. My name's Jeffrey Way, and I will see you later. Bye.